Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, good afternoon to you all. It is indeed my pleasure to welcome you to the International Peace Institute this afternoon. Today's event is inspired by Sven Koopman's new book, which is titled Negotiating Peace, a Guide to the Practice, Politics and Law of International Mediation. The book is a practical guide to negotiating peace. It looks at the difficulties and the dilemmas of negotiating agreements, illustrated by real-world examples. The book also offers existing solutions and possible future approaches to negotiating peace. And we are very lucky today because we have the author with us. So I will leave it up to him to give an overview of his findings and his key takeaways, which is in the book, as this is a backdrop for the discussion this evening. In addition to Sven, we are delighted to welcome to IPI Stef, who is the Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and we also have a distinguished panel which includes Teresa Whitfield, who is Director of Policy and Mediation Division in the UN Department of Political Affairs, and also Robert Dann, we are old colleagues, who is the political advisor to the Special Envoy of the UN Secretary General for Syria, my good friend Stefan de Mistura. The conversation will be moderated by Adam Day, who is head of programs at the Center of Policy Research at UN University. And with these words, I wish you a fruitful discussion, and we look forward to continue to work together in partnership on the important issues being discussed this afternoon. So it's now my pleasure to give the floor to Stefan Blok, the Foreign Minister of the Netherlands. You have the floor.
Publishing this book and thus offering to anyone your invaluable expertise and professional and personal experience really shows your tireless dedication to the cause of peace. You worked on some of the most serious crises, such as Syria and South Sudan, just to name a few. This guide has a special value. It also comes at the right moment. Looking at today's global challenges and threats, at violent conflicts and civil wars, we urgently need to find innovative approaches to prevent and solve them. As you have clearly conveyed in these pages, the role of mediation and mediators in preventing conflicts and averting escalations of violence is pivotal. As you have mentioned, the UN is now giving special priority to conflict prevention and mediation. And this is a remarkable shift in the UN's approach. The creation of the H-Lab by the Secretary General highlights the importance of the specific qualities of mediators and what they can mean in conflict situations. The Netherlands seizes any opportunity to show its convicted, staunch support to this endeavor. A topic that you also touch upon is inclusivity. Adopting inclusive approaches when it comes to peace talks and peace processes is becoming more and more important. This is indeed what the Netherlands stressed during a recent open debate on mediation of the UN Security Council as one of its non-permanent members. Engaging with NGOs and civil society is key to reach out to communities and to convey people's grievances. And in this context, an important topic you've also mentioned in your book is the reference to the role of women. The role of women in peace building is often underestimated, and for this reason, the Netherlands reiterates its support for the role of women in peace processes, particularly in mediation efforts. Reaching sustainable, long-lasting peace requires strong, constant commitment. Sometimes our efforts are not enough, not because we've not tried hard, but because circumstances and factors out of our control affected those goals we aimed at achieving. But many results have successfully been reached behind the scenes. As Secretary General Guterres pointed out during his first meeting in the UN Security Council, the television cameras are not on when a crisis is avoided. As you mentioned in your book, this book does not give the answer to negotiating peace. That's because it isn't an exact science, and it is for this very reason that what is contained in the pages of your book is so valuable. As you said, answers have to be sought again every time, because every conflict is different. And we must continue to learn from history, assess relevant options, understand law, and utilize a pragmatic approach so we can continue to negotiate sustainable peace. So let me conclude by heartily thanking mediation experts like you who have worked hard to save human lives and establish peace through their continuous efforts and commitments. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon and excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to start by thanking Minister Blok for coming to speak and Ambassador Rode Larsen for hosting this event. The Center for Policy Research is really delighted to have supported Sven in writing this book, which focuses on some of the key issues we as a think tank focused on the UN are also trying to grapple with. And I think your practical evidence-based tool for policymakers is exactly the kind of approach that we try to take in our work as well. So it was a real pleasure working with you on this. And today we have an exceptionally well-placed panel to discuss your book and the findings of it. We have you, Dr. Sven. And I think one of the things you really bring to this is your ability to speak from both UN experience inside and outside. And the breadth of your book, I'll note that it does include Herodotus and comes all the way up to the 21st century, is really incredibly broad and useful. We're incredibly lucky to have Teresa Whitfield, who has written extensively on many of these kind of processes. And your book on the ETA in the Basque country was one of the more riveting ones about mediation processes. And the definitive book on the Group of Friends and how international entities can come together to support peace processes. So we're very lucky to have you here. And joining us from Geneva, thank you for postponing your flight, is Robert Dann, who's the former chief of the Mediation Support Unit in DPA and currently advising the Syria peace process, and someone who's had some incredible experience in negotiating with some of the most difficult actors in the Middle East and beyond, and so some real practical experience and high-level experience as well. So we'll hear briefly from the panelists in that order, starting with Sven and then Teresa and then Robert, and then hopefully looking forward to engaging with you in the audience. Thanks so much for coming.
Great. Thank you very much, Adam, and thank you very much, first of all, to our very generous hosts, IPI, for organizing this event. I'd also say thank you very much to United Nations University, which actually made writing this book possible by funding me, even though when I got elected to Parliament, I had to hand in half of that money again to the Dutch state. But thank you very much. Thank you for everyone for being here. I see friends, former colleagues, both behind the table and in front of it. Thank you very much, of course, to friend, not colleague, but foreign minister, for your very kind words. Let me try to do something to at least deserve just a tiny part of that. As a member of parliament, as I became a year and a half ago, I had the pleasure last week of meeting the Dalai Lama. He came to the Netherlands, and I thought this is a chance to ask about peace, about the man who lives for peace. I said, Dalai Lama, you have your problem with China. How are you going to solve it? And he said, we have to find peace in ourselves, because peace lies within all of us. I thought, well, that's very inspiring. That's a very inspiring message, but it doesn't yet bring peace. So I thought maybe there is just a little bit more that we can bring to it. And so even though today I symbolically give the first copy of my book to the foreign minister, I hope, Foreign Minister, you allow me that I gave the 0 copy to the Dalai Lama, because I thought maybe there is just a little bit more than finding peace in yourself that we can contribute to the world. I came to that idea because I had the honor and privilege of working with Kofi Annan very briefly in Cyprus 15 years ago, and like the Dalai Lama, the late Kofi Annan had this wonderful presence. He had a voice to go with it. He also had a message that everybody was keen to listen to. But he also had a plan. And now the Annan plan for Cyprus didn't quite work, but at least he had a plan. And he tried. I think that is very important, because later on I got to work in Sudan and South Sudan, both for, let's say, the US in a way, for the European Union, and a bit for the UN, and I found that not everybody had a plan. It is not always easy as a peace negotiator to really know what it is that you can do. And in fact, there are, I think, three big problems in peace negotiations. First is with the parties. As I saw, for instance, in Darfur, quite often, the parties do not know what they want. Yes, they want to win the conflict, but they get to the negotiation table because they can't quite win. And the Darfur rebels, I would say, forgive me if any of them is listening, they knew they wanted to get rid of the government, and the government wanted to get rid of the rebels, but neither was working. And so we spent years trying to find out, okay, if you can't fully get what you want, what do you want instead? That was very difficult for parties to find out what they want. But then there is also a problem I find often with mediators. Because when I first got to work in the Central African Republic, also very briefly, I was flown in there. The next morning I was in a room. There were 4 rebels from the Central African Republic on that side, and behind the table, there were 9 mediators. And they all said, "Do you want peace?" And the rebels said, "Yes, we want peace." And they said that 9 times plus 4 times, and then the meeting was over. So I thought there is a problem with mediators not necessarily knowing what it is they can do. And then there is the third problem, which I think is that in the end, still, everybody thinks it's easy. It's what we do normally, but now around the peace negotiation table. So the rebels keep fighting at the peace negotiation table. The mediators sometimes are former politicians, former ambassadors, doing their usual thing behind the negotiation table. I think these 3 problems combine to one problem, which I call, and forgive me, amateurism. I think the problem is that very often people see peace negotiation as something you can also do. And you continue to do what you otherwise would do. And then the problem is also, everybody wants to do it. Everybody wants to be Kofi Annan. Everybody wants to win the Nobel Peace Prize. So my humble suggestion is, maybe we should abolish the Nobel Peace Prize. Because then maybe we can look at this more as something that requires experience, some knowledge of how it is done. Because the problem in this field is there are so many people who want to do it, also in the Central African Republic. At some point I wanted to get a meeting with the various rebels so we could have a peace conference. And the one group said, no, we can't do next week because we have a peace negotiation seminar in Sweden. And the other group had a peace negotiation seminar in the Netherlands. And the third group, the week thereafter, they had to go to Switzerland because they had to learn how to negotiate. There were so many people wanting to teach them and to help them negotiate that actually there was nobody to negotiate with. So I think that is a problem. So we need to look at it more in a practical sense. And that's why I think we need to try to come together and find out how things are done, how things have been done. I do not claim that in this wonderful book that there are any answers to how it should be done. That's not my position. But I did work with many of the people here and many people there to find out how was it done in Colombia, how did we do it with Syria, how was it done maybe in the time of the Treaty of Westphalia. I can tell you we've come a long way from that, at least, because in the 17th century, the Treaty of Westphalia, that also gave rise to the independence of the recognition of the independence of the Netherlands, there was a mediator. It was the Pope, and the Pope refused to meet with all non-Catholic parties. At least now we have gone a bit beyond that. But I think these type of examples are interesting because then we can learn from them. Not that they will tell us how now we should do it, but at least how we should not do it, or maybe sometimes examples from our wonderful host, Teresa Rood-Larsen, who has done such magnificent things for peace in the Middle East. Sometimes there are examples of how it can be done well. And of course, we cannot all be Kofi Annan. I think nobody can. But we can all try to learn from his successes and from his failures. And if we learn from those things, then maybe we can go just that little step beyond just finding peace in yourself. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. At the end of a long week, I'm amazed and impressed by how many of you have turned out this afternoon, and rather daunted as I feel a bit too tired to make any sense. It's very good to be here. Thank you to IPI, and thank you to UNU, and above all, thank you to Sven for having put in the massive amount of work into this book that is the occasion for us to be here and have a conversation about mediation and negotiating peace and learning from it. It's a bit sort of in-house thing. Robert, we didn't actually directly overlap, but I've had a long sort of friendly collegial relationship with the mediation standby, with a mediation support unit that Robert used to head, and with the standby team that Sven was on under Robert. I wasn't directly there then. I came in to head the policy mediation division as Robert moved to Syria and was replaced by my colleague Asif, and Sven left the standby team to become a politician, but it's very good to be up here with all of them. Mediation is a word that's used very broadly. And as the UN's guidance for effective mediation put it in 2012, mediation often exists alongside facilitation, good offices, and dialogue efforts. Mediation, however, has its own logic and approach, aspects of which may be relevant to other approaches to the peaceful settlement of disputes. This book is really about the narrow practice of mediation and offers an opportunity to discuss the art and craft of mediation and how it is done. I'm casting myself in a bit of a bad cop role, as I'm going to have some slightly critical comments as well as some praise. Also, I have a hunch that I've spent more time with the book than Robert, who's been drafted in at a late moment. So I'm putting myself out there on that. There are one of the pluses. It's admirably short, concise, accessible, and easy to use. And I say this not in a flippant way, but because a lot of the people that you're trying to reach are extremely busy with a short attention spans and sometimes limited capacity to read. So having something that is so well organized, there's an excellent excellent index at the beginning, and it actually makes it very easy to look things up. And people, I think, will use it in both ways. People will use it to look up specific things that they are struggling with, and also then may read the full kind of soup to nuts version, soup to nuts on mediation that it offers. But it's very user-friendly, and I commend you for that, because it's not easy to do something that covers so much ground so quickly. I really enjoyed the historical grounding of the book. Herodotus has already been mentioned. I was introduced to François de Caillère. I felt I should have known about him, and I poked around a bit. For anybody who doesn't know, he's quoted quite a lot. He's a 17th century writer and diplomat. It was special envoy of Louis XIV, who signed the Treaty of Ryswick in 1697. He wrote a book which I think sort of echoes through. There's a number of footnotes where you think it's going to refer to something more contemporary, and they keep coming back to him. His book, which has been translated as The Practice of Diplomacy, was described by J.K. Galbraith as being who said one wonders why anything more needed to be said on the subject. But so I was moved by Sven's book to order it, and found a very good piece of advice, which I think is echoed in Sven's book, and should be on the wall of every Secretary General. Examine with the greatest care the natural or acquired qualities of those citizens whom they dispatch on missions to foreign states. And I think your findings on mediators would encourage that. But within the historical context, the large bulk of the cases that Sven addresses are in the nearly 3 decades since the end of the Cold War, the period where the UN and others, in the wake of the sort of boom in negotiated settlements that followed the Cold War, kind of codified and developed a more professional approach to the practice of mediation. One of the things that we have found, and certainly the work of the UN in the 10 years since the creation of the Mediation Support Unit and the standby team, has put emphasis on the value of process design and other aspects of substantive mediation support, whether on gender and inclusion, constitution, ceasefires, whole range of issues, the values of these professional knowledge of these aspects of mediation to all sorts of conflicts. Some of these conflicts are structured in kind of a neat and tidy way as the ones that came out of the Cold War. If we look at the UN, there are certain legacy conflicts where Cyprus or Western Sahara, where there's a relatively clean structure, but things are stuck for other reasons. And others of the conflicts, and Robert can talk to the Syrian case, obviously, but many other conflicts we are involved in, Sven mentioned the Central African Republic, are much messier. I think we need to, and much messier, and don't actually, some of the advice that Sven gives would need to be adapted and modified and applied in different kinds of ways to these complicated conflicts with multiple and fragmented parties, multiple and fragmented mediators, and embedded in intensely complicated regional and geopolitical dynamics. We need to be careful not to think of complex, extended conflicts as new, as we look back to the 30 Years' War or other kind of conflicts. Those kind of conflicts have been around for a very long time. I think it's perhaps more sobering to recognize that the post-Cold War conflicts that informed our approach to mediation were probably the exception, and that now we're back in a much messier world than there was before, but those few years of the neatly resolved conflicts went away. I think that I have a couple of my major challenges or points of difference with the book is not so much in what is said, but in some respects what is not said. I think there are aspects of the shift since the Cold War which are probably, in my view, not sufficiently represented. It's not so much in the art or craft of mediation, of how you assemble the mediation team, the qualities of the mediator, or the structures or the need for a strategy and design of all those things. But I do think there have been some changes and not even on the conflicts, as I said. I think there's been some normative changes in the way that we approach mediation which have had really profound effects on the job of the mediator and made it harder. And these are perhaps not fully reflected within the book. First of all, peace and justice, the tension between peace and justice gets very short shrift. There's a couple of sentences scattered here and there. And yet, if you look at what happened, if you go back to El Salvador, where there was a general amnesty, what the international community was able to do in Cambodia, what the international community was able to do in Mozambique, and then you fast forward through the normative development of human rights norms, the creation of the ICC, the UN adopting clear positions on what it can and can't do on amnesties, and a kind of mobilization of the human rights movement, the demands on a mediator are much more, and the demands on conflict parties, we saw in the very difficult discussions around transitional justice in Colombia, or the even harder discussions around justice issues in the Central African Republic, and wait until we get to kind of accountability, whether it's in the current push for accountability, obviously in places like Myanmar or in Syria. And here you have both the shifting normative framework with regard to human rights and amnesties and the ICC, also a new communication environment where the level of evidence and knowledge about what happens and what has happened is much bigger. So that would be one element that I think is not as reflected in the book, and it might be. I also am going to be a bit tough on gender. I'm conscious of being the only woman up here, and I was here at IPI a couple of days ago on an interesting discussion on how we approach gender. And there's around the UN, as the Foreign Minister of the Netherlands has just pointed out, there's been a real shift in recent years, and it's been slow to come. 1325 was passed in 2000, as we all know. But the soft norm and hard norm obligation of mediators different in different places to incorporate there's two dynamics. There's meaningful participation of women in peace processes, but there's also the gendered approach to conflict. Sven addresses this. I'm not saying he doesn't, but the section on gender doesn't come until page 193 of a 200-page book, which I think is a little late, especially as all UN envoys certainly now know that they're having to grapple with these issues at the beginning of a process. Often not possible, and there was a discussion of this in the IPI thing, and I don't actually, and I will argue against those who push for quotas. It is not possible for a mediator to determine, to dictate to the parties who they have in their negotiating delegations. The relationship between a mediator and the parties is extremely delicate and complicated and evolves in different kinds of ways, though there are all sorts of things that a mediator can do to think of ways to include the voices and perspectives of women. And then there are all sorts of things that mediators, and Sven knows because he was on the standby team, and members of the standby team and all of us from the UN will do to introduce a gendered perspective to every single aspect of a peace process and an agreement, or at least try to. It's a bit, so the gender section in the book, and I'm saying this because some of you will read it and will come back to me if I don't say it, and I also want to put it out there, and with Sven's forgiveness. And UNU's forgiveness, because this is some of these editorial observations which UNU should have been a bit more astute to. It's a bit muddled in terms of the confusion of the meaningful participation and the gendered approach to the peace process. And then there's an unfortunate reference to something called distinctive women's topics, which I have no idea what this means. Yeah, it's on page 194. So I would challenge. I would challenge anyone to explain to me what a distinctive women's topic is, and I was thinking of maternal health care. But no, seriously, the issues, the gendered approach to issues within conflict, the different experiences that men, women, girls, and boys have of conflict, and the different needs and nuanced approach to what's in a peace agreement. Are of universal importance, because what we're all about in this is trying to create sustainable peace and more inclusive societies, which is certainly consistent with what Sven's work on the Book of the Whole is pointing to. So I will stop that. Thanks.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm looking forward to the panel discussion.
Keep everybody awake.
And let me first of all apologise for who I am not. I am not Stefan de Mistura, who was meant to be here, but the challenges of a mediation process meant that he had to jump on a plane and left me behind. And another one of our well-known mediators, Fink Haysom, likes to speak about swans and pigs in mediation. And a swan is the lead mediator, the Kofi Annan, who is handling high politics, handling large strategy, big picture, and then underneath her or him are the pigs. And they are in looking for the truffles, trying to find the piece of value that the swan can then work on. And I actually think that, so I'm not going to lead you to the logical conclusion of my introduction, which is that you didn't get the swan, you got the... But I have been doing such work for quite a lot of these mediators, and it's interesting to watch them. Each one is different. One of the people I work with very closely is Sven Koopmans, and this is a relationship that goes back quite a long way. And I think why the book is interesting and useful is that there are a lot of people who think they know a lot about mediation, how to bring people into a room and get them to talk to each other. A lot of people who know a lot about history. A lot of people know a lot about law. A lot of people know a lot about the UN. If you can find someone who knows quite a bit about all of those things and put it together, it's an extremely useful product. And I think that that's the service that Sven has done to our profession with this book, which is that... And I don't want to disagree with everything that has been said before, but I think that there's a lot that is not new under the sun in mediation. And I think it's actually not bad now and then to have a classical kind of understanding that whoever is appointed into any process will face all of the issues that are in this book, all of them. And there will be an enormous amount of money that will be focused on a couple of them. And actually, Teresa mentioned those. There will be a lot of people focusing on those aspects. But the issues that the mediator will have to work out in the first week and month or 5 years into the process is, how do I set an agenda here? How do I actually get the parties into the room? How do I turn my phone off? And all of those things are not new. And what is terribly important is that when mediators approach these problems, they don't approach them as though no one's ever thought of these before. No one's ever had these challenges. The parties don't agree with the names that each other wants to give themselves. Well, Sven has examples of this from the 17th century. The parties don't agree on what order they will discuss the issues in. There are many, many, many ways to deal with those problems. And so I think that the great service of the book is precisely its what I would call classical character. I think it's also terribly important, and the book is interesting because while it's called Negotiating Peace, it is particularly about the question of mediation. There's many other ways to negotiate peace, but it is particularly about the art and science of mediation. And mediation is not just the mediator, but it's the mediation team and the mediation strategy and the mediation environment. But I think Sven is correct that if you don't have a plan, every road leads nowhere in mediation. If you are a cork bobbing up and around on the ocean of conflict, you just get washed this way and that. And the art of being a good mediator is to have some sort of a strategy, which you change a lot, which you change all the time, but to have a North Star that you are moving towards, and that each action that you take is moving towards a particular goal. And that is much harder than it sounds. And particularly, as Teresa rightly said, well, actually not particularly, in all conflicts. In the classical old style, let's call them conflicts, Cyprus. I can tell you that having worked on Cyprus for many years, I have immense sympathy for the current person who is, on behalf of the Secretary-General, having to assess how to move that ball forward. And the choices that that person may or may not have to advise the Secretary-General to do. These are very, very difficult issues, and each choice that you make is a decision tree that you're going to come back to. On the other hand, the conflict that I'm currently having the honour to advise the Special Envoy on Syria is, of course, the archetypal, massively complicated, hugely violent, very difficult conflict with so many different dimensions, many different conflicts within the conflict. And to be able, within all of that, to find a process and find a structure that could bring the parties into a dialogue and into then peace at some point is a skill, and it's a very difficult thing to do. And one of the things I love about this book is that you can turn it open to almost every page and find a little technique and its opposite. A little technique and its opposite. Because it's very interesting when you're in the middle of these processes, people say things as though they are certain about them. Well, we must set a deadline. Must we? We can't set a deadline. Yes, we can. No, we can't. The choices are endless, actually. The range of tools, and in other words, a mediator and a mediation advisor also has to help expand the imagination of the mediator and also of the parties. The mediator's job is to help the parties expand their imagination and find a larger number of options by which to think about the situation in which they are trapped, because that is very often the situation. Now, let's also be clear that many conflicts that are attempted to be mediated, the parties are not actually looking to end them at that time. But that does not mean that conflict mediation is not important at that moment. Some in the jargon would call that trying to ripen the process or manage it or move it to a situation where it's ripe for peace talks. So I love the book. I think I think to pick up on what Teresa said, I think these contemporary themes in mediation are very big, and I actually look forward to talking about them in the panel. I won't in my introduction. I think the question of inclusion versus miniaturization in peace talks is extremely complicated, extremely complicated. The South African peace process, which is probably still the archetypal, well-run, well-thought-through, and often not mediated, by the way, peace process, began with secret talks between one person and one person. And it became a huge, inclusive national process. The point about that is that all of the above is required to move a society to a better place, which is what we're trying to do. We're trying to work with parties to help them improve their situation and get to a better place. And so in the Syria peace talks at the moment, we have certain aspects which are handled very discreetly and other aspects which are handled in a very large gathering. We have standing structures for how to ensure that civil society is brought into the process, but we have other aspects of the process that are handled in different ways. We have standing structures to ensure that women are in the process and that gender is on the table, and that is both mainstream throughout the process, but also it is something that we address distinctively. So all of the above is required. And I think what mediators are looking for very often is the toolkit. What's the toolkit? And I think if they open this book, they will find all sorts of useful tools. So I commend the book to you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Robert. I believe the minister has to leave now, so I just want to reiterate our thanks for coming here. And while he's leaving, I can just take an opportunity to give the ground rules that IPI has for audience participation. I think there are some people with microphones who will pass it around. What we'll do is take 2 or 3 questions, and then please just say your name and direct your question as briefly as possible. And then in the first round, I'd like to give also Sven a chance to react to some of the points made by the panel. But what I'd like to start doing now is, if there are any initial questions, any brave people that would like to pose an opening one, and then we'll turn over back to the panel. Thank you.
My name is Joanna Meyer. My question is to you, sir, about the opposite technique. I'm wondering if you could give an example or a couple examples of what a technique and then the opposite technique would be, please. Thank you.
Hi, this question comes from a viewer on Facebook named Christina Tay. She asks, mediation is a voluntary process. What can be done when a party or country doesn't want to engage in peaceful dialogue?
One more. Up, turn the back.
Daniel Forti, IPI. I just want to get your insights on how to handle situations where you have mediation within mediation processes. So, for example, either between smaller groups, such as political parties. So, for example, the South Sudan process where you had the intra-SPLM talks, or then, recently in Central African Republic with the Sudanese and Russia brief facilitation amidst the larger African initiative. So how do you navigate keeping everything on a single track? Thank you.
Thanks so much. I think we'll start with Sven in this first round, and then if other panel members have other responses to those questions. Please go ahead.
Thank you. What should I respond to first is the big question. Well, first, perhaps, to be polite, to the question from Facebook. Thank you for joining. What do you do when parties don't engage? Well, the short answer is still engage them. I learned, in part from Robert actually, that when parties don't want to come to talks, maybe they want to come to talks about the talks. So they don't want to sit around the table, but you can discuss with them what would make them come to the table. And if they don't want to discuss what could make them come to the table, you can at least talk to them about what they broadly want, so that they could start to be ready to be talking about what it will take to talk about joining the talks. There is always a higher level on which you can engage people. Now, that's the mediator's answer, I think. You also have the power answer. We are now talking about mediation much in the sense of the United Nations. But Richard Holbrooke, the late Richard Holbrooke, a successful US diplomat and mediator, he would say, if you don't want to talk, have you heard about the US Air Force? That's also an approach. There are many different approaches, but I think as a mediator you want to try the peaceful one first. As I'm going to try the peaceful approach regarding the comments that Teresa made. Now, Teresa will also forgive me for saying that my approach here is a realist approach. There are many different approaches, but I want to talk about how it works for mediators in practice. And one of the things I try to resist with my book is, and don't get me wrong, I am not saying Teresa does this, but what I want to resist is amateurism, because so many people invent it as they go along. The other thing I resist is political correctness. I think the mediation profession suffers a lot, first from actually not being recognized as a profession, second of all, from all those people who want to contribute to it by being part of it or by funding it, but by then saying, but what we find most important is this particular aspect. And whether that is environmental situations, human rights, gender, or jobs, all of these are choices, but they're political choices. Gender is extremely important in the peace process. And I think it needs to be discussed, and that's why I discuss it. I think the financing of peace agreement, I mean, you need to have money to be able to actually fly to meet people, is also important, but it's discussed at the end of the book, after the gender. But the more important thing is, what I find is not the ideological approach, are we politically correct? The approach is, what as a mediator do you actually need to do? What I don't think I describe in this book, but what I followed all the gender courses. I found it very important to know, to give the right place to the issues of women at the table and gender issues. But when I was in the middle of some African conflict, and for a brief moment I held the pen to draft a peace agreement, I was looking for what provisions do we actually want in this peace agreement so that the gender aspect is recognized. And then I found there was too little of it. And so in this book I say, no, there are these issues. And that is about family law, about inheritance rights, about political rights, about punishing sexual violations, many other things. So I say it's not just about sitting around the table, but it's actual practical things that improve people's lives. I think that is really important. And so that's why actually the quote, and then I'll stop, Mr. Chairman, is now there are many people say women should be at the table, and I say yes, we should need to do that. This is not to say, though, that those women included in delegations by themselves satisfy the need for a gender perspective. It would be a mistake to assume that the inclusion of women in delegations ensures that distinctive women's topics, such as inheritance, family law, and all these things, are taken care of. Women delegates may actually champion other issues, like who should be the president, what parliamentary system, or indeed share the line of their male colleagues. It can also be as said, and I've finished the quote, it can also be that they are included without much of a say, because I think that's the other big challenge. I think the world has progressed so much now that we take it as a given that there are women at the table and that there are also women mediators. But be aware that they are not just tokens, that they're not just there to have long hair or to look like, that they are also there because they have a voice, and that is not just a voice because they are a woman, but they are a voice because they are a person, and that they can contribute as such. And I think that's the essential thing. Thank you.
Thanks. Robert, and then, but do you want?
I was just asked a question about a technique and its opposite. I mean, the question of speed in a process is a classic one. When to move fast and when to move slow. And there's no right or wrong answer to that question. Within that, how to set a deadline, and is a deadline different from a target? So I think that another example is, how much consent does the mediator need to move forward? A very, very, very strategic question in all mediation processes, because I think what's terribly important in general, particularly in the early stages, but usually throughout a whole process, the parties have no confidence or very little confidence in each other, and they need to have confidence in the process, and that means they need to have confidence in the mediator and the mediation. And the mediator has to decide at various points when he or she decides, I'm going to push the parties further than they want to go, versus I'm going to let them go at the speed that they're comfortable. And that's a judgment call that you make all the time. And you have to decide, do they have enough of their constituency on board? If not, actually, I'll give them more time. Or, do they have enough of their constituents on board? No, it would help if I pressured them. It would actually help them. Very often, the parties in the mediator is often a bridge that the parties need to walk over. And so the mediator's ego is not the issue in the process, and the ego of the institution is not the issue in the process. So I think what I'm saying is that these are the things that the mediators are dealing with all the time out there. And there's no right answer. If you're a political advisor to a mediator, you should never say, well, you must only ever go at the pace the parties are comfortable with. But you should never say it's opposite either. And you are always measuring and balancing what is required to move the process.
Thanks. I certainly don't want to suggest that I don't want to go back and forth with Sven on this, and it's fine. And I don't want to suggest that I'm in any way opposed to a realist approach in things, or that raising human rights is politically correct. I was engaged in that the issue of justice and human rights is only a question of political correctness. In the Colombian process, you were dealing with people who were looking at were they going to sign an agreement if they were going to end up in jail, and started off with people who, and you look at what happened in the LRA process or many others, it's a very real issue that a lot of the people engaged in negotiations are people who have a lot of blood on their hand, and how are you going to get over this? There isn't a case of people ending up and signing an agreement and then trotting off to prison straight afterwards, and it is a huge, huge issue. Similarly, the question of inclusion is, of course, much broader than women, and I wanted to relate this to one of the questions about the questions of how do you engage the people who don't want to engage in a process. I agree entirely with Sven. I think all of us are going to be saying the same kinds of things, which is that there are always things to talk about. There is a particular challenge, and I think when we're thinking of inclusivity, you have to think about sort of constituency inclusivity. And if you're engaged in a complex conflict, you're thinking about sort of political breadth, the different armed actors. Who are the armed actors you can talk to? Who are the armed actors you can't talk to? I think from a UN perspective, you always should be thinking about which of the armed actors you can talk to. In some cases, there will be some that you can't. Sometimes for very good reasons, security reasons most obviously. Others for all sorts of other kinds of reasons which we can get into. We haven't touched on the kind of the new challenge of the kind of some of the actors involved in places like Syria. But you always should think about them. There are other kind of constituency questions related to minorities, religious leaders, and others, which won't necessarily be at that top table, but that is really the focus of this book. And I welcome the tight focus, but will crop up at some point. I think the very good question about with the example of the CAR. Mediation within a mediation. There are, at this point, many of the mediations we're engaged with are kind of multifaceted, multi-track, very, very messy. I think that one of the hard things that was raised in your posing of the question, there was a use of the word you, and many of these mediations, and Central African Republic would be a good example. There isn't the same kind of clarity of leadership with a single empowered and recognized mediator. The African Initiative has the lead, but if you look at the Central African Republic today, a country with an enormous UN peacekeeping operation, intensely complicated conflicts, there's an identified 14 armed groups. Much of the violence takes place outside the remit of those armed groups. The strategy to addressing, and there is a strategy to try and address those armed groups, has to be differentiated between some of the armed groups which may be taken on militarily, others have political goals, and it's possible to talk to. And an issue of who you can talk to can become quite quickly, what can you actually talk about? Is there a political agenda that can be discussed, or does a group either have the problem of being unable to express what it wants to talk, or it has goals which are simply not possible for a mediator, an international mediator, to negotiate. They're beyond what can be negotiated. But in somewhere like Central African Republic, you're unfortunately quite far away from the structured process. And we've all been saying for years and recognizing for years the benefits of a process where there is a clear mandate for a lead mediator who is recognized. But many of the contexts in which we're working, that isn't so clear.
Thanks so much. I think the panel's shown they can take pretty much any kind of question on and give a rich answer. So if there are any more people that would like to, please, ma'am, go ahead, or straight behind you.
Thank you. Congratulations, Dann, on your book. I'm very much looking forward to reading it. But I'm also going to challenge you on your comment about gender and inclusion. I think framing inclusion and gender as an issue of political correctness is quite limited. And mediators who do it for that reason, they're going to get very little out of it. And it's a mediator's ultimate objectives is to end the conflict. And looking at gender and inclusion as an issue of strategy, and a strategy to end the conflict in terms of sustainability, in terms of legitimacy, is some of the key reasons why inclusion is critical. And Stefan, who I think has done the most groundbreaking work in terms of setting up a women's advisory board, did not do it out of political correctness. I did have the opportunity to speak to him about this when I was looking at this issue, and he did it out of strategic reason. He needs many different components to move different components and also to bring different issues to the table. And so having a women's advisory board enables them to do that. And where mediators get inclusion right, they do it for strategic reasons. And also in terms of a rights-based agenda. It should be a part of the conflict analysis. I look at, for example, in Afghanistan, where there was a reconciliation process with Hizb Islami. And one of the challenges is the fact that there isn't an accountability mechanism. And those that are challenging it are not just human rights groups, but a variety of different stakeholders in the political process who see that it creates some precedents that are going to be problematic for them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I see a hand up in the very, very back, and then one in the very, very front. Sorry for the exercise for them.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. My name is Gabriella, and I'm wondering whether your book looks into what exists on kind of the local level mediation and ways that maybe these larger UN teams or mediation teams can learn from them and build upon them.
Hi, I'm a law school student interested in mediation. So my question for you, all of you, is how do you jumpstart a career in international mediation? Thank you.
By mistake.
We'll just follow the same order as last time, and then I'll reverse it for next time.
Well, I first want to thank my dear friend and former colleague Rina Amiri for the first question. And what both Rina and I know, that she was the gender advisor in the standby team that we were both in. And she knows that I always agree with whatever she says. And so I agree fully when she says gender, the issue of gender is not an issue of political correctness. Absolutely. We are fully in agreement. Gender is an essential, fundamental issue in peace talks. And in the outcome of peace talks. I think mostly, though, in the outcome of peace talks. because we can focus very much, and this is the part where I say political correctness comes in. We can focus too much on settings, on saying, no, we don't want this mediator because he may be very good, but this time around we need a woman. I think the most important thing is peace and the outcome. And maybe this man is actually more gender conscious than the other person who happens to be a woman. So I think go beyond that frame. And Rena, don't let me get personal, but we all know that nowadays mediation still needs a lot of funding, a lot of money to do it. And it is a case, and it's a pity that the foreign minister, who is with my party, and I like him very much, but that the foreign minister is gone. But nowadays, many governments, such as the Dutch government, focus very much on gender. But it's very hard to actually give that arms and legs. Because can you step in the Middle East peace process and say, you know, we as the Dutch government want this Israeli or Palestinian representative to be a woman, or we want this conflict in Colombia to go this or that way, you have this provision in the agreement on gender. It's very hard. So what do many governments do? They train women as mediators. They organize many conferences in The Hague, in Switzerland, in Sweden, and then the standby team has someone as wonderful as Rena to fly around to all those conferences, whereas instead I think Rena could do such wonderful things by actually convincing, as she has, the people in Somalia or in Yemen what actually needs to be in the peace agreement, and that it's funded and that it's actually done. And that's where I think that we should focus not so much on what is the fashion these days, whether it's inclusive mediation, mediation within mediation or so, but that we actually focus on what we want. And whether that's for women, for children, or for men, or for the environment, or for jobs, or for security, focus on the outcomes. That's the important thing. Thank you.
Thanks. I welcome the question on local mediation, not so much in the book, but though it comes into the different levels and in issues and cases that Sven covers, but it's something that I think we're really grappling with at the moment. And I notice in quite a lot of the mediation support that we supply, which is on all sorts of different issues in different places, there are missions, including in places where things are quite stuck. I mean, the missions, UN missions in Somalia or where they're not stuck, but the things are moving. But the central level, there's a kind of recognition that a national level process alone will not address the violence in the country because of the fragmentation of the violence, whether it's South Sudan or Somalia or CAR or Mali or Afghanistan or wherever. So we are doing quite a lot of work with our missions and our colleagues to help address or try and learn from. Sometimes it's learning from what's happening at a local level where national and local actors are able to address local conflicts, and sometimes it's strengthening our own capacities to help. One of the things that's hard, though, and that is a challenge, is to find ways of linking up what happens at a local level centrally, because you can work locally and you can do good things in preventing violence happening or helping resolve a local conflict, but the lasting trick and the challenge, and this is going back again to the example of Central African Republic, is how do you link things up locally to a national process, and how do you make it part of, again, a strategy and a plan to help things move forward more sustainably. I think we would all advocate the appointment of qualified mediators of either gender, and we all have to recognize that there's been some fairly useless men appointed all over the place, as well as some women who are stronger than others are not. So I think it's a bit of a dead argument. We need the best possible qualified people that we can find. And there are men, and Stefan, again, I would agree, I think the work that Stefan's done in very difficult circumstances, and there's been the Women's Advisory Board, and perhaps Robert will touch on that, was criticised, and there was a discussion here the other day about sort of add-on or integral. And the thing is that there are often things you can't do, and one of the roles of the mediator is to be extremely creative about the things that you can do, time can be a helpful asset. Things develop over time, and things that, as Robert pointed out on another things that seemed impossible or were the wrong thing to do at one point at a different stage in the mediation grow and take shape. And so there is a lot of capacity for creativity along with persistence to allow things to happen. Thank you.
Just a few observations. Maybe to start with your question. I think the best thing you can do to get involved in international mediation is to be curious. I think to be creative and curious. I know that's an odd thing to say, but I think that it doesn't come out so much in this discussion because this book is about the art of, once you are that person in the middle, how do you do it? But the people who are most useful in conflict situations are those who start with a granular understanding of the actual conflict itself, and then weave with that an understanding of the techniques and skills that are laid out here. And so it's terribly important to actually have knowledge about conflicts and to go and live among people who are in conflict, I'm afraid, and to know what it's actually like to be with rebels. One mediator that I admire very much talks about the importance of doing trench work and the skill of a mediator to go into the trenches of the parties and be with them. And while doing that, the other party's watching you in the trench with the other party. And to maintain the confidence of this party while you're in the trench with that party. Then to come out of the trench and say, I'm over in the trench with the other party, but I'll be back to yours soon. That's a metaphor, right? So what I'm telling you is, I don't know what you're studying, but I think that mediation, it can partly be learned, but a lot of it is also about your personality. As for how to get into it, I think that, looking for jobs, it's very hard to go straight into a mediation team. Looking for jobs that are as junior political officers or junior officers in some of the NGOs that are working in the field, including a lot of the local actors, is a great way to get into this profession. Beyond that, I leave it to Teresa as the head of the Policy Mediation Division to further develop strategies so that people like you can get into our business. I think another comment, I just wanted to respond a little more to the question from the lady at the back about local mediation, and tie it a bit to what I think is an emerging consensus in the discussion that was developing. I think I see an emerging consensus that gender and gender issues and women's inclusion issues are best when done with a strategy. And I think that that's something that actually we all fully agree on, and that they are very useful tools in a strategy. One of the interesting dimensions of mediation today, and it's something that I would say to the governments here rather than the mediators, if I can be blunt, is that when you're the mediator, you suddenly discover that people are creating a whole ecosystem of initiatives around you. And it's an ecosystem. It's the best way to describe it. It has tall trees and other ones, and there's vines everywhere. And they very seldom come to you and say, would you like to help us design a garden? In other words, we have money, we want to help this process, but we're not going to offer training to the rebels unless you tell us to. We're not actually going to begin a process with that until you actually tell us what the overall process is. Now, Teresa is right that actually these days that's sort of an ideal which is hard to do because very few of the processes have a clear lead mediator, which is why very few of them are working. But I do think that it's very important, particularly in the early phases of mediation. I watched when Kofi Annan was appointed as the mediator, and I was the first person on the plane with him in February 2012. And I remember on the plane saying to him, sir, there's going to be a huge amount of people coming with all sorts of initiatives, and they are going to create a massive ecosystem of things going on about Syria. And in addition to you working out how to talk to the president, how to talk to the opposition, how to talk to all the regional players, how to talk to the international players, what to do with all the different local initiatives that people will come up with, you also have to think about that. So this is why actually the book's very interesting, because this is what a real mediator has to deal with all the time. All this stuff is incoming at you, and in some way you have to give it shape and order and strategy and structure. And so I think What I think one of the main services we can deliver to local mediation processes is to run a good main process. I know that might sound odd, but it's actually very important because I think it's also true that local processes, I mean, in a place like Syria, they cannot actually grip the process, which is now a major international conflict where you have large numbers of players with their armies involved in the conflict. So there's a lot of things to think about in this business, and you have to think of all of the above every day in order to move the process forward.
Yeah, just to follow up directly on Robert's points, if you compare what Kofi Annan and Robert on their plane were flying into in Syria in 2012 with what Annan flew into in Kenya in 2008, and the Kenyan crisis, or 2007 into 2008, the Kenyan crisis was something on which everybody outside was agreed on what should happen, which was that Annan should work to prevent Kenya going over a cliff. And the fact that there was agreement around Kenya meant that Annan very deliberately basically rang up everybody with power and said, I'm running this and everything follows me, and he was able to do it. And I'm looking at Stina back there, who's worked with the Centre for Humanitarian Dialogue, was also involved, the UN was involved, the AU was involved, he was there in representation of the AU, the US, but it was possible in a situation where there was agreement regionally, internationally, that Kenya shouldn't go over a cliff. It was possible for the mediator to get everybody behind him and for things to work. Obviously, in Syria, you have the exact opposite of everything pulling in a very different direction, which then means that the mediator cannot possibly be on top of all the different things that are happening, because there are going to be actors, including member states, busy all over the place, fueling and funding all sorts of different things. So a really clear thing. And I think one of the few kind of empirical things we all know, and we all keep working on process where this doesn't hold, because that's what we do, but we all know that you don't get sustainable peace unless the region is behind it. You just can't do it. And you look at one of the things, that Colombia is a recent case where everybody wanted the Colombian peace agreement to work. There was no opposition, and it wasn't a mediated agreement. There was very effective international engagement by Cuba, by Norway, and others a bit further out. But it was able to work because there was a regional support for that process moving forward. Implementation, of course, is complicated by the nature of Colombia, but it moved forward. On the Korea question, which I should have addressed, I very much agree with Robert, and I would begin by saying don't try and work with the UN, at least not first. And I'm looking at some of my colleagues in my division who are in junior positions there, and they're all laughing at me. But and they have great jobs, and they have an interesting time, and they're all very happy. But in terms of, I would say first, like Robert, get out there, go to the field if you can. And I got into this work by working on El Salvador, and honestly, what made me interested in, and still drives me and drove me to write a weird book about ETA when nobody else was interested in ETA, was being fascinated and being privileged to sit with people who'd taken the really incredibly hard decision to take up arms, and trying to understand what it takes for people, regular, rational, normal people, to pick up arms and be ready to kill and be killed for something. And then you get to a point, and if you're the mediator, you're usually coming in, and then you're at a point where somehow you're trying to help them get down, and you're trying to help them get out, and trying to help them take the equally difficult, brave decision to put down the arms. And I spent in Central America, and then later on in other places, quite a lot of time just listening. And when I was young, and it shows how old I am, that this was during the Central American, the conflict in El Salvador, working as a journalist and getting stuck in camps with the guerrilla. You'd go up and you'd see them on the border with Honduras, and you'd get stuck because fighting would start, and I'd be bit nervous, but quite pleased because I was stuck, which would meant my 2-hour interview would turn into a 12-hour interview. And they were really bored because it's really boring sitting in a guerrilla camp on the border of Honduras. And so they're quite happy to tell me their life story. And it was the best learning. I have reasonably good degrees from reasonably good universities, but the thing that made a difference and drove me to be interested in that work was that. So if you can get out there, work for NGOs, it's easier to get into the UN, and then later we'll see what happens to the UN and that world, but there are plenty of other people doing mediation.
Thanks. I think Sven had one more follow-up on the local level mediation.
And on the two questions combined, First, I agree, of course, with everything that was said. I have to, but I also do. The track 2, I discuss it in the book. Track 2 is what we call discussions lower than sort of the government level and the rebel level, but where, as Teresa just described, I think that is very important to contribute also to the higher level mediation, as long as Robert has said, it is in some form of coordination. And that is indeed the call to funders and governments everywhere and to NGOs, try to coordinate. But then I say also to you as asking, how can I get a career in this field? Well, 2 small answers. One is, this is a way to get in. It is in part the way I got in, by working in the field in Albania, in Kosovo, with people, with an NGO, not necessarily on peace talks, but you learn how it is outside of where you are from. And then you get into the international world and maybe things develop. But my second point is, don't follow my example, because I was exposed a little bit into this world. I thought it was very interesting, but at that point I was an attorney, and I thought, how can I become a mediator, a peace negotiator? I thought, why don't I start to write a book about it? Now, I just started writing the book, and then I got a call, can you come to Sudan? And then that was over. And I thought, well, now I can continue. And then I got a call, can you come to Kosovo? And you know, I only finished this book when I got into Parliament. So the way to be a mediator is not write a book, because you end up with a different job. So don't do that.
Thanks so much. I think we have time for probably 2 more questions. I just wanted to add one point on the question of career, which is, when I first heard about Robert Dann, he was called the only guy in the UN who knew everyone in Hamas. And so in addition to curiosity, I think Robert's energy and bravery on that front is something that shouldn't be underestimated when you're talking about being pigs and swans, but really getting directly involved with parties. There was a question there in the middle. We'll take 2 more.
Thank you. I appreciate Teresa saying earlier that the UN sometimes recognizes that a local level process will not be enough to handle a conflict alone, because I have always reacted against a lack of humility on the part of the UN or other international mediators, who sometimes think that only that central person can be the one to solve a problem. But my understanding of mediation is not that you put yourself at the center, but that you actually try to empower local interlocutors so that they can at least feel like they're finding the solutions by themselves. So my question, and mainly to Teresa or others who may want to answer, is how do you think the UN can work better with local actors in a complementary way and really have complementary approaches? And if that requires building the capacity of empowering women and other local civil society, how should the UN best do that? Strengthening religious groups, strengthening NGOs and NGO networks. What can the UN do to really have that complementary approach, which I think would be optimal in most situations? Thanks.
Hi. The question I have follows actually on Gay's question, and I think Teresa and Sven had mentioned different aspects of this. And it's looking at the national processes and then more localized processes. The issue of sort of vertical integration and vertical linkages. If you have a national process, or even a district process, say, in a very large country, and then you have some local processes, how is it that how are the linkages created, not only for mediation processes, but for dialogue processes in general? I mean, like if you think of the Niger Delta, you know, and you think like 30 or 40 years ago, what might have happened if there had been some sort of local dialogue process in the Delta that had linkages to higher levels so that eventually they could have had input to the government? And what a difference that might have made in the history of the Niger Delta. So it's something that I've wondered about a lot, and I wonder if anyone can answer that.
I think we'll start with Teresa, since those seem to be directed at her. That'll have to be the last question on time, so please go ahead, Teresa.
Thank you. incredibly difficult questions to answer. I would say that I think that humility is absolutely essential. I really like still the 7 Deadly Sins of Mediation that Salman Ahmed and Brahimi wrote, and arrogance was one of them, and the UN has to remember that all the time, particularly the sometimes rapid turnover of UN personnel in places where it can take a long time to understand. I think that happy to have it as a separate conversation, but and it's always easy to say that it's context specific. But the first thing that the UN has to do is to invest time in understanding sort of local conflict dynamics and what's going on, because the answer is going to be different in different places. There are very different conflicts. There are very different capacities. And it's going to be different. And the UN has very many tools. There are places where it has peacekeeping operations, and sometimes this work is done by civil affairs officers. Other times it's done by other actors, even within peacekeeping operations. There are different structures and people who are best placed to engage locally. In non-mission settings, there are places where there may be humanitarian actors have there are just different structures, and I think it's a part of a long conversation, and it has to begin with humility and has to begin with understanding who's out there, what they might need and what they might not need. In some places, the UN will actually be not the right actor to come in, and it may be a local NGO or an international NGO who has deep roots in a particular place like Somalia. There are different, both local and international actors who have deep roots in particular bits of the country that the UN might not have, and then it behoves the UN to work with them. So it's a very complicated thing. And the other point I would say about linking local to national, which relates to the second question, is obviously it is intimately related to the structure and capacities of the state concerned. And in some places, the local conflicts or the work that is doing is out there, and it's removed from the central state because there isn't effective state structures and institutions and infrastructure to do those links. And again, there's a challenge in Central African Republic of how to do those links and what the relationship is. It a state? Is it a state local or a local local, or what the relationship of the state, or what again, and somewhere like Somalia where there's multiple moving parts at different levels, and so there are local conflicts, and then there's the broader question of the evolution of the relationship between the federal states and the center, and how that's going, and how the local conflicts fit in with that. I mean, they're very, there's a lot of very complicated issues, but I think the UN has to start with contextual analysis, be very humble, look at who's best to do things, and in what way can the UN help. Sometimes it's providing logistical support and moving people around to enable them to talk, and those kind of things, rather than leading a political process. And also, again, relate to the state and the regional dynamics, because quite often some of the local conflicts that we're seeing in broad parts of the world where the UN is very engaged are unfortunately connected to regional and we haven't at all talked about kind of economic interests and transnational flows and transnational economic dynamics, which obviously intersect very, very directly with conflict. Thanks.
I think Robert's ceding his time to Sven for the last word on the panel.
Well, thank you very much. I think Teresa already very ably answered the main question. If I can say some concluding things, I would say whether it is about your career or it's about track 2 or about any particular topic within mediation that you care about, the most important thing is to have a plan. Your plan may not always succeed. In fact, it is very likely not to succeed. But you can learn from failure. But at least if you have a plan, you have something to strive towards. And the problems I have encountered in mediation, whether it is with parties or with mediators or with funders, donors, writers, thinkers, problem, particularly on the ground, is if you don't have a plan, then there is always a reason to wait. There's always, well, there will be elections soon, or maybe somebody else will come to power, or they will have an armed shipment, or maybe we wait for the next seminar. Or if you don't have a plan, there's always a reason to wait. At the same time, if you don't have a plan, everything is urgent, because something just happens. now there is an election. Oh, there is an arms shipment. Oh, well, he has said something. Oh, we've heard on the news. If you don't have a plan, then you can't prioritize. Then you always feel that everything is urgent. So at the same time, without a plan, there's always a reason to wait. And if you don't have a plan, everything is always urgent. And I think the one thing that you can contribute as a mediator, or as somebody who thinks about mediator, is try to help develop a plan. And then be flexible. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Before we do give applause, I actually get the last word with 2 or 3 sentences. One of the things that struck me, I've been doing research on preventive diplomacy and mediation for much of the last year, and a lot of these apparent tensions, peace versus justice or inclusivity versus the need to get things done quickly and move forward with the parties, often aren't tensions when you dig under the surface and talk to people that are actually working on these processes. Often when they describe their actual experiences and some of the experiences you draw in, those tensions aren't real. They're just apparent. And what we're really looking at the Center for Policy Research is how to develop a clear evidence base to show how inclusion of youth, of women, of other marginalized communities can help sustainability of peace processes, because it does. And I think when you talk to people that are actually involved in these processes who have developed these kind of strategies, they all agree that those kinds of strategies do work. And I think developing an evidence base to really underpin and bolster the principles is an important bit of work. And the second point really brings me to, is what we're talking about when we say a peace process succeeds or a negotiation succeeds. In Yemen in 2011, there was an apparent success of a process, and in 2013 it all fell apart. Very similar other points that you can think of where you think, oh, the mediation has succeeded, something has been delivered, and then longer term it falls apart. I think what's interesting to think about is how to bridge these kind of technical procedural activities with sustainable outcomes. And what I really like about some of the discussion we've had here today is we're starting to pick apart those. What does it mean to have an effective strategy, and also think about how that's going to be linked to longer term success. For us at CPR, that's really the big challenge, and what we really appreciate is the very nuanced and ground-driven approach that you've taken, and we're really grateful to have participated in it. Thank you to Teresa and Robert for making time to talk to us, and to IPI, really a huge thanks for hosting this event. Please join me in congratulating Sven on his book, and go buy it.